Bhagavate Vāsudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vāsudevaya. Narayanam Namaskritya Naram Chaiva Narottamam Devim Sarasatim Vyasam Tato Jayam Udhiraye. We're continuing our perpetual reading. I don't know if you can continue something that's perpetual. I guess you can. You couldn't start up a perpetual. We're continuing our reading of the Srimad Bhagavatam at Canto 3, Chapter 7, text number 1. This chapter is entitled Further Inquiries by Vidura. Is it okay? Shri Shukadeva Goswami said, O king, while Maitreya, the great sage, was thus speaking, Vidura, the learned son of Dvaipayana Vyasa, expressed a request in a pleasing manner by asking this question. Sri Vidura said, O great Brahmana, since the Supreme Personality of Godhead is the complete spiritual whole and is unchangeable, how is he connected with the material modes of nature and their activities? If this is his pastime, how do the activities of the unchangeable take place and exhibit qualities without the modes of nature? Purport. As described in the previous chapter, the difference between the Supersoul, the Supreme Lord, and the living entities is that the activities of the Lord in creating the cosmic manifestation are performed by the Lord through the agency of his multifarious energies. But this manifestation is bewildering to the living entities. The Lord is therefore the master of the energies, whereas the living entities are subjugated by them. By asking various questions about transcendental activities, Vidura is clearing the misconception that when the Lord either descends on the earth in his incarnation or appears himself with all his potencies, he too is subjected to the influence of Maya, just like an ordinary living entity. This is generally the calculation of less intelligent philosophers who consider the position of the Lord and that of the living entities to be on the same level. Vidura is hearing the great sage Maitreya refute these arguments. The Lord is described in this verse as Chinmatra, or completely spiritual. The Personality of Godhead has unlimited potencies to create and manifest many wonderful things, but both temporary and permanent. Because this material world is the creation of his external energy, it thus appears to be temporary. It is manifested at certain intervals, maintained for some time, and again dissolved and conserved in his own energy. As described in Bhagavad Gita 8:19, Bhutva praliyate. But the creation of his internal potency, the spiritual world, is not a temporary manifestation like the material world, but is eternal and full of transcendental knowledge, opulence, energy, strength, beauties, and glories. Such manifestations of the Lord's potencies are eternal and are therefore called nirguna, or free from all tinges of the modes of material nature, even up to the mode of material goodness. The spiritual world is transcendental even to material goodness, and thus is unchangeable. Since the Supreme Lord of such eternal and unchangeable qualities is never subjugated by anything like material influence, how can his activities and form be conceived to be under the influence of illusory Maya, as is the case with some living entities? A juggler or magician displays many wonders with his acts and arts. He can become a cow by his magical tactics, and yet he is not that cow. But at the same time, the cow displayed by the magician is not different from him. Similarly, the material potency is not different from the Lord because it is an emanation from him. But at the same time, that manifestation of potency is not the Supreme Lord. The Lord's transcendental knowledge and potency always remain the same. They do not change, even when displayed in the material world. As stated in Bhagavad Gita, the Lord descends on the earth by his own internal potency. And therefore there is no question of his becoming materially contaminated, changed, or otherwise affected by the modes of material nature. The Lord is saguna, by his own internal potency, but at the same time he is nirguna, since he is not in touch with the material energy. The restrictions of the prison house are applicable to prisoners who are condemned by the king's law, but the king is never affected by such implications, although he may visit the prison house out of his good will. In the Vishnu Purana, the 6 opulences of the Lord are stated to be non-different from him. The opulences of transcendental knowledge, strength, opulence, potency, beauty, and renunciation are all identical with the personality of Godhead. When he personally displays such opulences in the material world, they have no connection with the modes of material nature. The very word chinmatratva is the guarantee that the Lord's activities are always transcendental. Even when displayed in the material world, his activities are as good as the Supreme Personality of Godhead himself. Otherwise, liberated devotees like Shukadeva Goswami would not have been attracted by them. Vidura inquired how the Lord's activities can be in the modes of material nature, as is sometimes miscalculated by persons with a poor fund of knowledge. The inebriety of the material qualities is due to the difference between the material body and the spirit soul. The conditioned soul's activities are displayed through the medium of the modes of material nature and are therefore perverted in appearance. However, the Lord's body and the Lord himself are one and the same, and when the Lord's activities are displayed, they are certainly non-different from the Lord in all respects. The conclusion is that persons who consider the Lord's activities material are certainly mistaken. Text 3. Boys are enthusiastic to play with other boys or with various diversions because they are encouraged by desire. But there is no possibility of such desire for the Lord because he is self-satisfied and detached from everything at all times. Purport. Since the Supreme Personality of Godhead is one without a second, there is no possibility that anything besides him can exist. He expands himself by his energies in multi-forms and self-expansions and separated expansions as well, just as fire expands itself by heat and light. Since there is no other existence besides the Lord himself, the Lord's association with anything manifests his association with himself. Since there is no other existence besides the Lord himself, the Lord's association with anything manifests his association with himself. In Bhagavad Gita 9.4, the Lord says, Maya tatamidang sarvam jagadavyakta murtina mastani sarvabhutani na chaham keshvavastitaha. The complete manifestation of the cosmic situation is an expansion of the Lord himself in his impersonal feature. All things are situated in him only, yet he is not in them. That is the opulence of the Lord's attachment and detachment. He is attached to everything, yet he is detached from all. 4. By his self-sheltered potency and by his self-sheltered potency of the three modes of material nature, the Lord has caused the creation of this universe. By her, he maintains the creation and conversely dissolves it again and again. Purport. This cosmic universe is created by the Lord for those living entities who are carried away by the illusory thought of becoming one with him by imitation. The three modes of material nature are for the further bewilderment of the conditioned souls. The conditioned living entity, bewildered by the illusory energy, considers himself a part of the material creation due to forgetfulness of his spiritual identity, and thus he becomes entangled in material activities life after life. This material world is not for the purpose of the Lord himself, but is for the conditioned souls who wanted to be controllers due to misuse of their God-gifted minute independence. Thus, the conditioned souls are subjected to repeated birth and death. 5. The pure soul is pure consciousness and is never out of consciousness, either due to circumstances, time, situations, dreams, or other causes. How then does he become engaged in nescience? Purport. The consciousness of the living being is always present and never changes under any circumstances, as above mentioned. When a living man moves from one place to another, he is conscious that he has changed his position. He is always present in the past, present, and future, like electricity. One can remember incidents from his past and can conjecture about his future also on the basis of past experience. He never forgets his personal identity, even though he is placed in awkward circumstances. How then can the living entity become forgetful of his real identity as pure spirit soul and identify with matter unless influenced by something beyond himself? The conclusion is that the living entity is influenced by the avidya potency, as confirmed in both the Vishnu Purana and the beginning of Srimad Bhagavatam. The living entity is mentioned in Bhagavad Gita 7.5 as Para Prakriti, and in the Vishnu Purana he is mentioned as the Para Shakti. He is part and parcel of the Supreme Lord as potency and not potent. The potent can exhibit many potencies, but the potency cannot equal the potent at any stage. One potency may be overcome by another potency, but to the potent, all potencies are under control. The jiva potency, or the Kshetrajna Shakti of the Lord, has the tendency to be overwhelmed by the external potency. Avidya karma samgya. And in this way, he is placed in the awkward circumstances of material existence. It's awkward. Sounds euphemistic. The living entity cannot be forgetful of his real identity unless influenced by the avidya potency. Because the living entity is prone to the influence of the avidya potency, he can never equal the supreme potent. Text 6. The Lord as the Supersoul is situated in every living being's heart. Why then do the living entities' activities result in misfortune and misery? The next question put forward by Vidura to Maitreya is, why are the living entities subjected to so many miseries and misfortunes in spite of the Lord's present in their hearts as Supersoul? The body is considered a fruitful tree, and the living entity and the Lord as Supersoul are like two birds seated in that tree. The individual soul is eating the fruit of the tree, but the Supersoul, the Lord, is witnessing the activities of the other bird. A citizen of the state may be in miseries for want of sufficient supervision by the state authority. But how can it be possible that a citizen suffers from other citizens while the chief of the state is personally present? From another point of view, it is understood that the jiva living entity is qualitatively one with the Lord, and thus his knowledge in the pure state of life cannot be covered by nescience, especially in the presence of the Supreme Lord. How then does the living entity become subjected to ignorance and covered by the influence of Maya? The Lord is the father and protector of every living entity, and he is known as the Bhuta Brit, or the maintainer of the living entities. Why then should the living entity be subjected to so many sufferings and misfortunes? It should not be so, but actually we see that it happens everywhere. This question is therefore put forward by Vidura for solution. O great and learned one, my mind is generally illusioned by the distress of this nescience. And I therefore request you to clear it up. Purport: such mental bewilderment as represented here by Vidura takes place for some living entities, but not for everyone. For if everyone were bewildered, there would be no possibility of a solution by higher personalities. Sri Shukadeva Goswami said, O King Maitreya, being thus agitated by the inquisitive Vidura, at first seemed astonished, but then he replied to him without hesitation, since he was fully God conscious. Since the great sage Maitreya was filled with God consciousness, he had no reason to be astonished at such contradictory questions by Vidura. Therefore, although as a devotee he externally expressed surprise, as if he did not know how to reply to those questions, he immediately became perfectly settled and properly replied to Vidura. Yasmin vignate sarvam evam vignatam bhavati. Anyone who is a devotee of the Lord knows about the Lord to some extent, and devotional service to the Lord makes him able to know everything by the grace of the Lord. Although a devotee may apparently express himself to be ignorant, he is full of knowledge in every intricate matter. Maitreya said, certain conditioned souls put forward the theory that the Supreme Brahman, or the Personality of Godhead, is overcome by illusion, or Maya, and at the same time they maintain that he is unconditioned. This is against all logic. Purport: sometimes it appears that the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is 100% spiritual, cannot be the cause of the illusory potency which covers the knowledge of the individual soul. But factually, there is no doubt that the illusory external energy is also part and parcel of the Supreme Lord. When Vāsudeva realized the Supreme Personality of Godhead, he saw the Lord along with his external potency, which covers the pure knowledge of the individual living entities. Why the external energy acts in this way may be considered as follows, as analyzed by great commentators like Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur and Srila Jiva Goswami. Although the material illusory energy is distant from the spiritual energy, it is one of the many energies of the Lord, and thus the material modes of nature, the mode of goodness, etc., are surely qualities of the Lord. The energy and the energetic personality of Godhead are not different, and although such energy is one with the Lord, he is never overpowered by it. Although the living entities are also parts and parcels of the Lord, they are overcome by the material energy. The inconceivable yogam aishvaram of the Lord, as mentioned in Bhagavad Gita 9.5, is misunderstood by the froggish philosophers. In order to support a theory that Narayan, the Lord himself, becomes a Daridra Narayan, a poor man, they propose that the material energy overcomes the Supreme Lord. Srila Jiva Goswami and Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, however, offer a very nice example in explanation. They say that although the sun is all light, the clouds, darkness, and snowfall are all part and parcel of the sun. Without the sun, there's no possibility of the skies being overcast with clouds or darkness, nor can there be snowfall on the earth. Although life is sustained by the sun, life is also disturbed by darkness and snowfall produced by the sun. But it is also a fact that the sun itself is never overcome by darkness, clouds, or snowfall. The sun is far, far away from such disturbance. Only those who have a poor fund of knowledge can say that the sun is covered by a cloud or by darkness. Similarly, the Supreme Brahman or the Parabrahman, the Personality of Godhead, is always unaffected by the influence of the material energy, although it is one of his energies. Parasya Shaktira Vivadaiva Shruyate. There's no reason to assert that the Supreme Brahman is overpowered by the illusory energy. The clouds, darkness, and snowfall can cover only a very insignificant portion of the sun's rays. Similarly, the modes of material nature may react upon the ray-like living entities. It is the misfortune of the living entity, certainly not without reason, that the influence of the material energy acts on his pure consciousness and eternal bliss. This covering up of the pure consciousness and eternal bliss is due to avidya karma sangya, the energy which acts on the infinitesimal living entities who misuse their minute independence. According to Vishnu Purana, Bhagavad Gita, and all other Vedic literatures, the living entities are generated from the Tatastha energy of the Lord, and thus they are always the energy of the Lord and are not the energetic. The living entities are like the sun's rays, although, as explained above, there is no qualitative difference between the sun and its rays. The sun's rays are sometimes overpowered by another energy of the sun, namely by clouds or by snowfall. Similarly, although the living entities are qualitatively one with the superior energy of the Lord, they have the tendency to be overpowered by the inferior material energy. In the Vedic hymns it is said that the living entities are like the sparks of a fire. The sparks of a fire also are fire, but the burning potency of the sparks is different from that of the original fire. When the sparks fly out of touch with the original fire, they come under the influence of a non-fiery atmosphere. Thus, they maintain the potency to be again one with the fire as sparks, but not as the original fire. The sparks can everlastingly remain within the original fire as its parts and parcels, but the moment the sparks become separated from the original fire, their misfortune and miseries begin. The clear conclusion is that the Supreme Lord, who is the original fire, is never overpowered, but the infinitesimal sparks of the fire can be overpowered by the illusory effect of Maya. It is a most ludicrous argument to say that the Supreme Lord is overpowered by his own material energy. The Lord is the master of the material energy, but the living entities are in the conditioned state, controlled by the material energy. That is the version of Bhagavad Gita. The froggish philosophers who put forward the argument that the Supreme Lord is overpowered by the material mode of goodness are themselves illusioned by the same material energy, although they think of themselves as liberated souls. They support their arguments by a false and laborious jugglery of words, which is a gift of the same illusory energy of the Lord. But the poor froggish philosophers, due to a false sense of knowledge, cannot understand the situation. In the 6th Canto, 9th chapter, 34th verse of the Srimad Bhagavatam, it is stated, "Thus the demigods prayed to the Supreme Lord, that although his activities are very difficult to understand, they can still be understood to some extent by those who sincerely engage in the transcendental loving service of the Lord. The demigods admitted that although the Lord is apart from the material influence or creation, he nevertheless creates, maintains, and annihilates the complete cosmic manifestation by the agency of the demigods. Text number 10. The living entity is in distress regarding his self-identity. He has no factual background, like a man who dreams that he sees his head cut off. Purport. A teacher in school once threatened his pupil that he would cut off the pupil's head and hang it on the wall so that the child could see how his head had been cut off. The child became frightened and stopped his mischief. Similarly, the miseries of the pure soul and the disruption of his self-identification are managed by the external energy of the Lord, which controls those mischievous living entities who want to go against the will of the Lord. Actually, there is no bondage or misery for the living entity, nor does he ever lose his pure knowledge. In his pure consciousness, when he thinks a little seriously about his position, he can understand that he is eternally subordinate to the mercy of the Supreme Lord, and that his attempt to become one with the Lord, the Supreme Lord, is a false illusion. Life after life, the living entity falsely tries to lord it over material nature and become the lord of the material world, but there's no tangible result. At last, when frustrated, he gives up his material activities and tries to become one with the Lord and speculate with much jugglery of words, but without success. These activities are performed under the dictation of the illusory energy. The experience is compared to the experience of one's having his head cut off in a dream. The man whose head has been cut off also sees that his head has been cut off. If a person's head is severed, he loses his power to see. Therefore, if a man sees that his head has been cut off, it means that he thinks like that. It means that he thinks like that in hallucination. Similarly, a living entity is eternally subordinate to the Supreme Lord, and he has this knowledge with him. But artificially, he thinks that he is God himself, and that although he is God, he has lost his knowledge due to Maya. This conception has no meaning. This conception has no meaning. This conception has no meaning, just as there is no meaning to seeing one's head being cut off. This is the process by which knowledge is covered. And because this artificial rebellious condition of the living entity gives him all troubles, it is to be understood that he should take to his normal life as a devotee of the Lord and be relieved from the misconception of being God. The so-called liberation of thinking oneself God is that last reaction of avidya by which the living entity is entrapped. The conclusion is that a living entity deprived of eternal transcendental service to the Lord becomes illusioned in many ways. Even in his conditional life, he is the eternal servant of the Lord. His servitude under the spell of illusory Maya is also a manifestation of his eternal condition of service. Because he has rebelled against the service of the Lord, he is therefore put in the service of Maya. He is still serving, but in a perverted manner. When he wants to get out of service under material bondage, he next desires to become one with the Lord. This is another illusion. The best course, therefore, is to surrender unto the Lord and thus get rid of the illusory Maya for good, as confirmed in Bhagavad Gita 7:14. Daivayesh gunamayi mama maya duradyaya mamevaye jante maya metam tarantite. And now we'll take a few reflections or questions. Yes.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
I'm curious, how is it that the Lord is simultaneously attached to everything and detached from everything? I think it said that in the end of the purport to text, the 3rd verse.
Well, in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, Samoham sarvabhuteshu name dveshostina priya ye bhajanti tumam bhaktya mai te teshu chapyaham. And our acharyas have opined that the first line, that is Samoham sarvabhuteshu name dveshostina priya, indicates Krishna's relationship with living entities with a sense of detachment, which is reciprocal based on yayata mam prapadyante, because the living entities are not interested in him, they're only interested in his order supplying. Therefore, he remains somewhat detached. But ye bhajanti tumam bhaktya mai te teshu chapyaham, they say, indicates that when a living entity begins worshiping the Lord, then the Lord becomes reciprocally attached. And so much so that when Brahma mentions the process of self-realization and the culmination of it, he says, Gyani prayasa munapasya namanta eva jivanti san mukaridam pavadiya vartam stane stita shrutikatam tanavan manobir e prayaso jita jito pyasitaistar lokyam. There's a way in which, if one takes an interest in Krishna, especially through stane stita shrutigatam, steadily hearing about him, then Krishna feels conquered by such a person. Prabhupada comments, not there but elsewhere, because that's not his purport, that Krishna allows himself to be conquered by the devotee because of the devotee's attachment to him. And Maya Mrugam Tayite Ichitaman Vadavad, from the verse from 11th Canto Karabhajana Muni, also mentions that Lord Chaitanya becomes attached to the living entities, so much so that he runs after them to deliver them from their attachment to material nature. In summary, there's a way in which, starting with Samoham Sarvabhuteshu, Krishna's detached, but Ye Bhajanti Tumam Bhaktya, when the living entity shows deference to Krishna over Maya, then Krishna becomes attached to the living entity, so much so that he says, they're in me and I'm in them. That's attachment. So it depends on the reciprocation of the living entity.
But that makes it seem that he's detached from some and attached to others. But here what it's saying is that the opulence of the Lord's attachment and detachment, he is attached to everything, yet he is detached from all.
That's a very Upanishadic sounding statement, because he's attached to his devotees. He says in the Srimad Bhagavatam that they're more dear to him than his very life. So I'm just saying that he's not eternally detached from his devotees. You were going to make a point?
For that question, I was thinking of the opulence of the Lord. Srila Prabhupada starts with the opulence of the Lord. Yogam Aishwaram. In Bhagavad Gita also it is said Yogam Aishwaram, where he first says that I'm in everything, and then he says I'm not in everything. It says Pashyame Yogam Aishwaram, that this is my behold my mystic opulence. So I was thinking of that also. Yeah. And I have a question.
Okay.
So here Vidura asks a couple of questions. In the start, he says that how is he connected to the material nature, and if this is his pastime, how do the activities of the unchangeable take place and exhibit qualities without modes of nature? How he enters into the modes of nature without getting affected by it. And then also it was asked by Vidura that if he is self-satisfied without any desire, why would he anyways create this and all? In the second
Why would he what?
he asks, boys are enthusiastic to play because they have this desire, but Lord has no such desire. Then why would he do anything? That question was asked by Vidura. And the second question he asked,
I didn't understand the first question.
The first question by Vidura was, so my question was that he asked two questions, but it was not answered by Maitreya. He just skips those, feels like, and directly answers the why the pure soul comes in the contact of the matter.
Oftentimes, when it appears in the chapter and then you stop 10 verses in, it hasn't been answered yet.
Yeah.
Coming up. What's the second question?
Okay, we can see, but I have read, like, doesn't...
I know.
Okay.
It's nerve-wracking. Go ahead.
The second was, like, do you have any reflection or realization on this up till this part by the answers by Maitreya? You have any reflections of this section?
If you hold that mic really close,
if you have any reflections or realization of these sections, if you have any comments you would like to share.
Do you have any reflections on this section?
Yeah, if you have any comments.
One reflection is that the question that Vidura is raising is perennial. It shows up elsewhere, like in the prayers of personified Vedas. It's a similar idea. How is it that the material nature can accommodate spiritual energy? I see a commonality in that as a thread. And I've always liked this verse about head being cut off in a dream. Head being cut off, seeing your head cut off in a dream. I find relief in knowing what Prabhupada just said in that purport, that we have everything already to understand our real position. It requires a slight adjustment. And whatever suffering we're experiencing is temporary and illusory, in the sense that we're misinterpreting what's actually happening because of a false sense of self. Those are my reflections. Yes?
It's kind of that, it's that classic question that everybody asks, that, if we're pure souls and we're, in the spiritual world and we love Krishna and we're full of eternity, knowledge and bliss, then how do we end up, why would we ever have the idea of coming to the material world and taking a material body? And it's kind of what Vidura is asking, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it seems that what he's saying is that that it's all an illusion. Like, we're not really covered, we're not really ignorant, we're not really suffering. And it reminds me of that other purport from the First Canto where Prabhupada talks about when you dream that a tiger's chasing you, but then you wake up and you realize that there was no tiger, there was no suffering, it's just a matter of dreams. So it seems like the conditioned state of the living entity in the material world is a dream, and it's not real, in the sense that it's not our real existence. We're just temporarily illusioned in this dream world, and we just need to wake up, and then we're going to be who we are.
Yes.
So it's kind of like, in this fall of the jiva question, did we fall, did we not fall? It's kind of like, well, there's a way in which we fell, but we never actually fell. We just kind of fell asleep, but we're still ourselves lying in our bed in the real world, but we're not conscious of that because we're, you know what I mean?
Well, the word fall is prevalent everywhere. No matter what the philosophical underpinning of it is, the word fall and the concept of falling is always accompanies the living entity's sojourn in the material world. So that we can take for granted, that it's a fallen situation, but analyzing exactly at what time or from which situation the living entity falls. Prabhupada says in the Bhagavad Gita, 13th chapter, 20th verse, in his purport, that we can't understand at this point. He said the Lord knows what the circumstances are, but we can't. And then he said it really doesn't matter. That saves a lot of trouble, that it doesn't matter. It saves me a lot of trouble from getting more and more involved in that. And even in a dream, when you're being pursued or you're late for a flight or whatever, there's still a sense of suffering until you wake up and then you realize it was an illusory. Or if you've ever had a situation where you thought somebody said something bad about you, and then you suffered for the whole week thinking, oh, they hate me, and then it turns out they weren't really talking about you in the first place. It's, it's conjured, and it doesn't mean you didn't suffer, but it's a misplaced kind of, because of a misplaced understanding. Prabhu? Okay.
From Bhagavatam Canto 10, chapter 14, text 26, Lord Brahma mentions this same point, that the conception of material bondage and the conception of liberation are both manifestations of ignorance. Being outside the scope of true knowledge, they cease to exist when one correctly understands that the pure spirit soul is distinct from matter and always fully conscious. At that time, bondage and liberation no longer have any significance, just as day and night have no significance from the perspective of the sun.
And it's one of the reasons that endless speculation about a topic that we don't have context for is exhausting. But Bhaktivinoda Thakur says when one comes to a vision of oneself as being separate from matter, that the living entity, Asangohyayam Purushaha, never actually had any connection with the material nature in the first place, it assuages any of those vitaraga bhaya, the sense of I've been victimized, which is oftentimes this impetus for asking the question, how did I fall down? A lot of it is psychological, as I really feel that I don't deserve any of this. Huh?
Whose fault is it?
Yeah. Whose fault is it anyway? But when one sees I don't have anything to do with the material body or material nature anyway, it's not even an issue anymore. As Narada says in the 5th chapter, First Canto, he said that I came to the position I saw that the Lord and I are one in quality, and he sees for himself that he doesn't have anything to do with the material world. That's sort of the waking up from a dream, and there's so much waking up from a dream, it's almost gone instantly. Most dreams I know I'm involved with, once I wake up, it's not an issue anymore. It seems so superfluous and ephemeral that you're just like, okay, I'll move on. Yes.
Srila Prabhupada really liked the analogy of the froggish philosopher.
Yeah.
And last night, Bhakta Brian and I were trying to figure out where it's actually coming from. So I was just digging up a little research, and it's coming from a Chinese philosopher from the 4th century. That was very interesting.
What's the name of the philosopher?
I have it here. It's maybe difficult for me to pronounce. I wasn't sure if this was like an original story, but Srila Prabhupada came up with It's Zhuangzi, a Taoist philosopher. It's Chinese.
He was Taoist.
Uh-huh.
Well, the really interesting thing I'd like to know, well, I think it's interesting, is to trace back where Prabhupada first heard it. Can you do that?
There's some mention of Vivekananda, Swami Vivekananda sharing it, so that could be.
Using that. Okay.
Yeah.
It
Thank you.
appears.
That's very interesting.
It appears in the Upadesh Upakyayana of.
Is that the
Bhakti-
Outside People's Party?
Yes.
I can't hear you.
Hare Krishna.
We're going to adjust the mic, the speakers.
Hare Krishna.
Okay, please go ahead.
It comes from the Upadesh Upakyayana of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati.
Upadeshapadhyayana.
It's a collection of short stories which Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati used to tell, which have moral or devotional lessons. They almost look like children's stories, and when you're reading them, it doesn't really make any sense. So it appears in that book of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. It was a story he used to tell frequently.
Thank you. Very helpful.
And
yes.
sorry.
Just a side note before you go on. Prabhupada used to reference Aesop's fables as well to make points. Like sour grapes is one that's from Aesop's fable. Go ahead.
In regards to this attachment and unattachment, in the Sri Upanishad verse 5, the first few paragraphs, Srila Prabhupada is explaining the inconceivable nature of the Lord, and that's what allows the devotee to accept the Lord as being supreme. And then there's this purport which kind of concludes the idea, in which Prabhupada says, in the Bhagavad Gita, the Lord says that how we treat his devotee depends on the devotee's, the Lord says that how he treats his devotee depends on the devotee's degree of surrender. The Lord reserves the right not to reveal himself to anyone and everyone, but to show himself only to those souls who surrender unto him. Thus for the surrendered soul he is always within reach, whereas for the unsurrendered soul he is far, far away and cannot be approached.
That's kind of what I said in the beginning with Samaham Sarvabhuteshu. It's a good reference. Thank you. Any more from the Outside People's Party? Is everyone okay out there? Anything more from the Inside People's Party?
Hare
Making
Krishna, I have a
discrimination.
quick question.
Sabaya Abhyantara Shuchi. Yes, go ahead.
As regards to the attachment and unattachment, like
Detachment, non-attachment.
detachment and attachment. So when someone is completely like detached from the Lord and is like serving just the material energy, is the Lord like involved in this person's life at all, or are they like, how is the Lord reciprocating in their life? To like what degree is the Lord reciprocating?
Well, everything is the Lord, and there's a way in which even the material energy is Krishna's energy. So there are gradations of involvement that the living entity has with Krishna according to the degree to which his consciousness is covered, starting with Annamoy, which means that there's this sense of taste that comes from eating, and then Pranamoy, and then Jnanamoy, Vijnanamoy, and Anandamoy. Each one of them is described as a successively higher realization but the living entities always has some relationship with the Lord. And as Prabhupada writes in the Chaitanya Charitamrita Adi Lila, chapter 4, verse 34, that every living being has an appreciating capacity according to the body and the way it's developed consciousness. And the more that one develops one's appreciating capacity, the more one is able to reciprocate with the Lord, who's always extending himself to every living entity. It's not that there's a time at which the living entity is, or the Lord forgets the living entity. It's the opposite. Gajendra says that. When he offers prayers, he said, my Lord, you're never lazy about reciprocating with me. It's me who has forgotten to pray to you. And Prabhupada mentions in the purport, it's not that when we just pray sincerely, that's the time Krishna pays attention. But he's always attentive, never lazy. It's just a matter of how much we've developed our appreciating capacity. I didn't hear anything. Okay? Uh-oh, I think he left.
Sorry, I was trying to figure out.
He didn't like the answer.
Thank you.
He's gone on parikram to try to walk it off. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to continue unless there's a volley of questions that come up. No volley. Text 11. Everyone okay?
Yes.
As the moon reflected on water appears to the seer to tremble due to being associated with the quality of the water, so the self associated with matter appears to be qualified as matter. The Supreme Soul, the Personality of Godhead, is compared to the moon in the sky, and the living entities are compared to the reflection of the moon on water. The moon in the sky is fixed and does not appear to quiver like the moon on water. Actually, like the original moon in the sky, the moon reflected on the water should also not quiver. But because of being associated with water, the reflection appears to be quivering. Although in actual fact the moon is fixed, the water moves, but the moon does not move. Similarly, the living entities appear to be tainted by material qualities like illusion, lamentation, and miseries, although in the pure soul such qualities are completely absent. The word pratiyate, which means apparently and not actually, like the experience of having one's head cut off in a dream, is significant here. The reflection of the moon on the water is the separated rays of the moon and not the actual moon. The separated parts and parcels of the Lord entangled in the water of material existence have the quivering quality, whereas the Lord is like the actual moon in the sky, which is not at all in touch with water. The light of the sun and moon reflected on matter makes the matter bright and praiseworthy. The living symptoms are compared to the light of the sun and the moon illuminating material manifestations like trees and mountains. The reflection of the sun or moon is accepted as the real sun or moon by less intelligent men. And the pure monistic philosophy develops from these ideas. In fact, the light of the sun and the moon are actually different from the sun and moon themselves, although they are always connected. The light of the moon spread throughout the sky appears to be impersonal, but the moon planet as it is personal, and the living entities on the moon planet are also personal. In the rays of the moon, different material entities appear to be comparatively more or less important. The light of the moon on the Taj Mahal appears to be more beautiful than the same light in the wilderness. Although the light of the moon is the same everywhere, Due to being differently appreciated, it appears different. Similarly, the light of the Lord is equally distributed everywhere, but due to being differently received, it appears to be different. One should not, therefore, accept the reflection of the moon on the water as actual and misunderstand the whole situation through monistic philosophy. The quivering quality of the moon is also variable. When the water is standing still, there is no quivering. A more settled, conditioned soul quivers less, but due to material connection, the quivering quality is more or less present everywhere. Text 12, but the misconception of self-identity can be diminished gradually by the mercy of the Personality of Godhead Vāsudeva through the process of devotional service to the Lord in the mode of detachment. The quivering quality of material existence, which comes from identification with matter or from thinking oneself under the material influence of philosophical speculation to be God, can be eradicated by devotional service to the Lord by the mercy of the Personality of Godhead Vāsudeva, as discussed in the First Canto, because the application of devotional service to Lord Vāsudeva invites pure knowledge. It quickly detaches one from the material conception of life and thus revives one's normal condition of spiritual existence even in this life, and frees one from the material winds which cause one to quiver. Only knowledge in devotional service can elevate one towards the path of liberation. The development of knowledge for the purpose of knowing everything without rendering devotional service is considered fruitless labor, and one cannot get the desired result by such labor of love. Lord Vāsudeva is pleased by devotional service only, and thus his mercy is realized by association with pure devotees of the Lord. Pure devotees of the Lord are transcendental to all material desires, including the desire for the results of fruitive activities and philosophical speculation. If one wants to acquire the mercy of the Lord, he has to associate with pure devotees. Such association alone can, by degrees, release one from the quivering elements. 13. When the senses are satisfied in the seer supersoul, the Personality of Godhead, and merge in him, all miseries are completely vanquished as after a sound sleep. Do you like this verse? I need a verbal yes.
Yes.
Purport. The quivering of the living entity as described above is due to the senses. Since the entire material existence is meant for sense gratification, the senses are the medium of material activities, and they cause the quivering of the steady soul. Therefore, these senses are to be detached from all such material activities. According to the impersonalists, the senses are stopped from work by merging the soul in the supersoul Brahman. The devotees, however, do not stop the material senses from acting, but they engage their transcendental senses in the service of the transcendence, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. In either case, the activities of the senses in the material field are to be stopped by cultivation of knowledge, and, if possible, they can be engaged in the service of the Lord. The senses are transcendental in nature, but their activities become polluted when contaminated by matter. We have to treat the senses to cure them of the material disease, not stop them from acting, as suggested by the impersonalists. In Bhagavad Gita 2:59, it is said that one ceases all material activities only when satisfied by contact with a better engagement. Consciousness is active by nature and cannot be stopped from working. Artificially stopping a mischievous child is not the real remedy. The child must be given something better. The child must be given some better engagement so that he will automatically stop causing mischief. In the same way, the mischievous activities of the senses can be stopped only by better engagement in relation with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. When the eyes are engaged in seeing the beautiful form of the Lord, the tongue engaged in tasting prasada or remnants of foodstuff offered to the Lord, the ears are engaged in hearing His glories, the hands engaged in cleaning the temple of the Lord, the legs engaged in visiting His temples. or when all the senses are engaged in transcendental variegatedness, then only can the transcendental senses become satiated and eternally free from material engagement. The Lord, as the Supersoul residing in everyone's heart, and as the Supreme Personality of Godhead in the transcendental world, far beyond the material creation, is the seer of all our activities. Our activities must be so transcendentally saturated that the Lord will be kind enough to look upon us favorably and engage us in His transcendental service. Then only can the senses be satisfied completely and be no longer troubled by material attraction. I just one reflection about something that happened to me. I was there was a devotee I met in Dallas, and she came from a Baptist family. She was a Baptist. Generations of her family were Baptists. Her husband was a Baptist, is a Baptist minister. And it took a long time for her to get ready for initiation. And then, somehow or other, by Krishna's arrangement, it was on. So I went to Dallas. And meanwhile, I had been corresponding with her husband because he wasn't convinced that it was a great idea. And although it was all Krishna's arrangement, still I was contemplating how would I present this, because her husband was coming to the initiation, and also her whole congregation who had never been to a Hare Krishna temple. Baptist church congregation. They all came to the initiation. If you've ever tried to, in your head, tone your voice for the audience, this was definitely. So somehow I was in sort of Baptist consciousness from the conversations I was having, and also just thinking, what do Baptists look at? What do they do? What are their feelings? What is their surrounding? That's what I was thinking about. And when I arrived in Dallas, it was evening time in the morning. I was there for the morning program, and the temple there is ornate and variegated. And there was a way in which, just by nature of the circumstance, I was comparing what it's like to be in a Baptist church to be what it's like in a Hare Krishna, because I was trying to see through the eyes of the congregation, what are they going to experience when they come here. Baptist church generally doesn't have much. There's only one symbol, it's a cross. They don't even hang a Jesus figure on it. It's just the cross. That's it. There's nothing else. And then when I was looking at, as the lights came up in the temple room, there are these paintings of Krishna with the gopis playing with the cowherd boys. Meanwhile, we had an uproarious musical event at 4:30 a.m. Meanwhile, people are throwing water at you. There's fire being passed around. There's incense plumes coming out. There's people waving fans. And then you're sitting there minding your own business, and somebody comes, swabs you with the thing that practically knocks you over. What the scent of the oil. I was thinking, the contrast couldn't be more. Sensory overload from the transcendental world. So it made me think of this transcendental variegatedness, or when all the senses are engaged in transcendental variegatedness. And I was thinking, to come out of the material world, you have to have, for lack of a better word, and not meant to be used pejoratively, an onslaught of the sensory experience that we have, that from moment to moment, I mean, where do you get people blowing conch shells until your ears are almost deafened? And then, the whole gamut of what we have here in Vrindavan, there's never a dull moment. going around on parikram in every direction, went to speak of Krishna's pastimes. Or wait, what? What did he do? So I was appreciating this refuge from the banalness, if there is such a word, of no iconography, no sense of imagery, and just a concept of somebody died for your sins compared to the big festival that's going on in the spiritual world. And by the way, it was a really funny circumstance, just to finish the story, because I did give the lecture. People appreciate it, but there in Dallas, you do the initiation in the temple room, and she was more forthcoming with Krishna conscious lingo than I was in front of the congregation. And although I was trying to tone mine for the congregation, she just came out and was very demonstrative. But then after that part, one of the devotees who's been there forever, he came over and he goes, okay. He goes, wait till they see the fire. Because that was going to be upstairs. Christians and fire and all that. And so anyway, it added to the dichotomy. And life goes on. I'll just read a few more verses. This is text number 14. Simply by chanting and hearing of the transcendental name, form, etc. of the Personality of Godhead, Sri Krishna, one can achieve the cessation of unlimited miserable conditions. Therefore, what to speak of those who have attained attraction for serving the flavor of the dust of the Lord's lotus feet? And yeah. The congregation was perfectly lovely too. I mean, they were very nice. Two different methods for controlling the material senses are recommended in the Vedic scriptural wisdom. One of them is the process of jnana, or the path of philosophical understanding of the Supreme, Brahma, Paramatma, and Bhagavan. The other is that of direct engagement in the transcendental loving service of the Lord. Of these two most popular methods, the path of devotional service is recommended here as the best because one on the path of devotional service does not have to wait for the attainment of the fruitive results of pious activity or for the results of knowledge. The two stages of executing devotional service are, first, the stage of practicing devotional service with our present senses under the regulations of the recognized scriptures, and second, attaining sincere attachment for serving the particles of the dust of the lotus feet of the Lord. The first stage is called sadhana bhakti, or devotional service for the neophyte, which is rendered under the direction of a pure devotee, and the second stage is called raga bhakti, in which the mature devotee automatically takes to the various services of the Lord out of sincere attachment. The great sage Maitreya now gives the final answer to all the questions of Vidura. Colon. Are you ready? It's a colon. It means that here it is. Devotional service to the Lord is the ultimate means to mitigate all the miserable conditions of material existence. The path of knowledge, or that of mystic gymnastics, may be adopted as a means for the purpose, but unless mixed with bhakti or devotional service, they are unable to award the desired result. By practicing sadhana bhakti, one may gradually rise to the point of raga bhakti, and by performing raga bhakti in loving transcendental service, one can even control the supreme powerful Lord. There you have it. Vidura said, O powerful sage, my Lord, all my doubts about the Supreme Personality of Godhead and the living entities have now been removed by your convincing words. My mind is now perfectly entering into them. Purport, the science of Krishna, or the science of God and the living entities, is so subtle that even a personality like Vidura has to consult persons like sage Maitreya. That goes to something we discussed the other day. I forget who asked the question. It said, why is it that Vidura, who's called a pure devotee, and Maitreya was you, who was referred to as a mixed devotee earlier. Here, the science of Krishna consciousness, the science of God and the living entities is so subtle that even a personality like Vidura has to consult persons like the sage Maitreya. It reminds me, in any discipline, one always needs some guidance. And if I can bring up a completely mundane example, remembering back to a time in the world of tennis when Andre Agassi was the king of the world. And his coach was Brad Gilbert, who wasn't even half the tennis player that Andre Agassi was, but he was a highly effective coach, obviously, for his client over so many years because he took that role and he was meting out advice based on his observations, and it was very effective. I've always taken this sentence to sort of be a response to that inevitable question that comes up: why is Vidura going to Maitreya if Vidura has a higher quality of devotional service? Doubts about the eternal relationship of the Lord and the living entity are created by mental speculators in different ways, but the conclusive fact is that the relationship of God and the living entity is one of the predominator and the predominated. The Lord is the eternal predominator, and the living entities are eternally predominated. Real knowledge of this relationship entails reviving the lost consciousness to this standard. And the process for such revival is devotional service to the Lord by clearly understanding from authorities like the sage Maitreya one can become situated in real knowledge. And the disturbed mind can thus be fixed on the progressive path. It also made me think of the enigmatic verse, Aham Vedmi Shukoveti Vyasaveti Naveti Va Bhaktim Bhagavatam Prayam Na Budhaya Na Chatikaya, which is a statement that in the verse, I know, Vyasa may or may not know the ultimate conclusion. And there's been some discussion around that verse as when one's playing the role of the teacher, then if one's ego is not in the way, then there are ways in which Krishna uses that person to answer or to dispel doubts and so forth. How can Vāsudeva not know? Well, he's the one who's mentioned Maya Mugdha Jivara Nahi Swata Krishna Gyan Jivara Kripaya Kola Krishna Veda Puran, that he's the one who's dispelling the darkness and the ignorance of the living beings. Text 16, O learned sage, your explanations are very good, as they should be. Disturbances to the conditioned soul have no other basis than the movement of the external energy of the Lord. Purport, a living entity's unlawful desire to become one with the Lord in every respect is the root cause of the entire material manifestation. For otherwise, the Lord has no need to create such a manifestation, even for his pastimes. The conditioned soul under the spell of the external energy of the Lord falsely suffers many unfortunate incidents in material life. The Lord is the predominator of the external energy, Maya, whereas the living entity is predominated by the same Maya under the material condition. The false attempt of the living entity to occupy the predominating post of the Lord is the cause of his material bondage. And the conditioned soul's attempt to become one with the Lord is the last snare of Maya. Both the lowest of fools and he who is transcendental to all intelligence enjoys happiness, whereas persons between them suffer the material pangs. The lowest of fools do not understand material miseries. They pass their lives merrily and do not inquire into the miseries of life. Such persons are almost on the level of animals, who, although in the eyes of superiors are always miserable in life, are unaware of material distresses. A hog's life is degraded in its standard of happiness, which entails living in a filthy place, engaging in sex enjoyment at every opportune moment, and laboring hard in a struggle for existence, but this is unknown to the hog. Similarly, human beings who are unaware of the miseries of material existence are happy in sex life and hard labor are the lowest who are. Similarly, human beings who are unaware of the miseries of material existence and are happy in sex life and hard labor are the lowest of fools. Yet because they have no sense of miseries, they supposedly enjoy so-called happiness. The other class of men, those who are liberated and are situated in the transcendental position above intelligence, are really happy and are called Paramahamsas. But persons who are neither like hogs and dogs, nor on the level of the Paramahamsas, feel the material pangs, and for them inquiry about the supreme truth is necessary. The Vedanta Sutra states, Atato Brahma Jignasa. Now one should inquire about Brahman. This inquiry is necessary for those who are between the Paramahamsas and the fools, who have forgotten the question of self-realization in the midst of life in sense gratification. But, my dear sir, I am obliged to you because now I can understand that this material manifestation is without substance. Although it appears real, I am confident that by serving your feet, it will be possible for me to give up the false idea. The sufferings of the conditioned soul are superficial and have no intrinsic value, like the cutting off of one's head in a dream. Yet, although this statement is theoretically very true, it is very difficult for the common man or the neophyte on the transcendental path to realize practically. However, by serving the feet of great transcendentalists like Maitreya Muni, and by constantly associating with them, one is enabled to give up the false idea that the soul suffers from material pangs. By serving the feet of the spiritual master, one is enabled to develop transcendental ecstasy in the service of the Personality of Godhead, who is the unchangeable enemy of the Madhu demon, and whose service vanquishes one's material distresses. The association of a bona fide spiritual master like sage Maitreya can be of absolute help in achieving transcendental attachment for the direct service of the Lord. The Lord is the enemy of the Madhu demon, or in other words, he is the enemy of the sufferings of his pure devotee. The word rati rasa is significant in this verse. Service to the Lord is rendered in different transcendental mellows, relationships: neutral, active, friendly, parental, and nuptial. A living entity in the liberated position of transcendental service to the Lord becomes attracted to one of the above-mentioned mellows. And when one is engaged in transcendental loving service to the Lord, one's service attachment in the material world is automatically vanquished. As stated in Bhagavad Gita 2.15.9, Rasa varjam rasopyasya palang drishtva nirvartate. The service attachment to the material world is vanquished. Persons whose austerity is meager can hardly obtain the service of the pure devotees who are progressing on the path back to the kingdom of Godhead, the Vaikunthas. Pure devotees engage 100% in glorifying the Supreme Lord, who is the Lord of the demigods and the controller of all living entities. Purport: the path of liberation, as recommended by all authorities, is to serve the Mahatma Transcendentalists. As far as Bhagavad Gita is concerned, the Mahatmas are the pure devotees who are on the path to Vaikuntha the kingdom of God, and who always chant and hear the glories of the Lord, rather than talk of dry, profitless philosophy. This system of association has been recommended since time immemorial, but in this age of quarrel and hypocrisy, it is especially recommended by Lord Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Even if one has no assets of favorable austerity, if he nevertheless takes shelter of the Mahatmas, who are engaged in chanting and hearing the glories of the Lord, he is sure to make progress on the path back home, back to Godhead, from rags to riches. After creating the total material energy, the Mahatattva, and thereby manifesting the gigantic universal form with senses and sense organs, the Supreme Lord entered within it. Fully satisfied by the answers of the sage Maitreya, Vidura wanted to understand the remaining portions of the creative function of the Lord, and he took the clue from the previous topics. The Purusha incarnation lying on the causal ocean is called the original Purusha in the material creations, and in his Virat form, in whom all the planets and their inhabitants live, he has many thousands of legs and hands. The first Purusha is Karnadakshayi Vishnu, the second Purusha is Garbhadakshayi Vishnu, and the third Purusha is Shiradakshayi Vishnu, in whom is contemplated the Virat Purusha, the gigantic form in which all the planets, with their different developments and inhabitants, are floating. O great Brahmana, you have told me that the gigantic Virat form and his senses, sense objects, and 10 kinds of life air exist with 3 kinds of life vigor. Now, if you will, kindly explain to me the different powers of the specific divisions. O my Lord, I think that the prowess manifest in the forms of sons, grandsons, and family members has spread all over the universe in different varieties and species. O learned Brahmana, please describe how the leader of all the demigods, namely Prajapati Brahma, decided to establish the various manus, the heads of the ages. Please describe the manus also, and please describe the descendants of those manus. The human race, or Manusya Sar, descends from the manus, sons and grandsons of the Prajapati Brahma. The descendants of Manu reside in all the different planets and rule all the universes. And don't look now, but we're just reading Bhagavatam, right? And that brings us to the Gayatri break. 12 o'clock, we'll be back here at 10 minutes after 12 for another rousing session of further inquiries by Vidura. Gaur Premanande. Happy Gayatri.